It is now my honor and pleasure to invite Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, to deliver the luncheon address.
Excellencies, distinguished guests and friends, let me first say that the term luncheon address is probably a bit of a misnomer. I understood that I'm going to make a few opening remarks before having a dialogue and discussion on issues on your mind. And I thought in my opening remarks I will focus on the challenges that are common to all of us. In fact, I would say not just in the region and in Asia, but internationally. Everywhere in the world, there is a real challenge of, first, sustaining broad prosperity, not just economic growth, but a breadth of benefits in our societies, sustaining broad prosperity, steady and broad-based growth in living standards, increase in living standards. That's the first challenge in the advanced economies and the developing economies, in those in between as well. The second challenge that we all have is that of keeping our societies together. It's about cohesion. It's about keeping a forward-looking spirit amongst all members of our society. And that is a challenge which requires continuous work. It is work that's never fully done. And each time we think we've achieved a new compact, a new basis for social cohesion, new challenges come up, either internationally, in the rest of the world, or domestically. So these are two central challenges we all face, and which all political systems face, and all political systems ultimately derive their legitimacy from how they handle these two challenges: sustaining broad prosperity and keeping people together and keeping a forward-looking spirit. On the first issue, how we can achieve broad-based prosperity. If you read the newspaper headlines, if you read the magazine articles, the mood is despondent. Christine Lagarde just mentioned a few days ago that we are in for a prospect of the new mediocre becoming the new normal. Mediocre growth, globally and in the advanced economies especially, becoming normal. And that's a very real prospect, to be frank. It's a very real prospect. The advanced economies are now in a new phase, and they haven't broken out of what is a rut of loss of confidence, high unemployment, low investment, and very little of this forward-looking spirit. Asia and the countries in the region have a bit more of a tailwind behind us. Some things are going for us: young populations, the scope for urbanization, rapidly emerging middle class, and the advantages that we can get out of regionalism, regional cooperation. So some things are going for us. But I think it's always important to remind ourselves that nothing is preordained. Growth is not preordained. Asia's ascendance is not preordained. Our catch-up with the advanced countries is not preordained. And indeed, the whole history of the last 60 years following the war has not been one of remarkable catch-up on the part of developing countries with the most advanced. There was a phase in which Europe and Japan caught up with the United States or came close to American levels of income and productivity. A few smaller Asian countries then moved up quite quickly and are now what you might call upper middle income countries: Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. But there have been few other examples of convergence with the advanced countries. The economists always thought that convergence would happen almost automatically and logically over a long period of time, but it hasn't happened in most places. China is one of the few recent exceptions, which I'll come to later. In Latin America, the level of productivity today compared to the United States is the same as what it was in 1960. And the same is true for much of the developing world. There's some successes. In our part of the world, for instance, Malaysia has moved up. But still, I would have to say, we are underperforming our potential in the region. We are underperforming our potential. Our potential to catch up, to converge, which is a story of skills, technological progress, strong institutions, all the mechanisms of advancing market capitalism for the benefit of our citizens. We are underperforming our potential. So we have things that are going for us, and there's a tailwind, but nothing is preordained, and serious reforms are necessary in every economy, in every society, and regionally, if we are to achieve our full potential. The fact that the advanced economies are in a slow growth mode, or almost no growth mode, might lead some people to think, well, look, if the frontier is not moving very fast, it's easier to catch up with the frontier because the chaps in front are not moving ahead. In fact, the situation is the reverse. In fact, it's quite counterintuitive. When the chaps in front are not moving ahead, life gets more difficult for everyone. A little paradoxically, life gets more difficult for everyone because the chaps in front, the leading countries, become more inward-looking. There's a certain amount of domestic paralysis when it comes to decision-making on both domestic and international issues. International trade initiatives get stymied, and a spirit of international cooperation gets weakened. So when the countries that are closer to the frontier are in trouble, everyone finds it more difficult. So there's a real challenge, and it means even more serious reform in each of our societies. And I want to highlight two areas which require more fundamental thinking on all our parts. The first may sound like a truism, but unfortunately is not accepted as true by everyone. And that is that an outward orientation in economic strategies is still far superior to an inward orientation. It was a big debate in the 50s and 60s. We thought it was settled because there's markedly superior performance coming out of an outward orientation, but the tendency to look inward is always there, is always there. The tendency to think, why don't I have a strategy of substituting for imports through my own domestic production? There's always that tendency. The mantra of the international organizations doesn't help, because the new mantra is that of moving away from export-oriented growth towards domestic demand. And on the face of it, there's some sense in it, because the world economy is growing more slowly, domestic demand in Asia is growing because of our emerging middle class and so on. But that's a demand perspective. And what leads to growth at the end of the day is not demand, but supply, skills, entrepreneurial ability, technological progress, productivity. That's what leads to improvements in living standards. It's what happens on the supply side, not the demand side. So yes, there is domestic demand in Asia that's growing faster than the rest of the world. The question is whether our production, both in goods and services, should be aimed at a domestic market and aimed at substituting for imports through domestic production, or should we aim for the global market and open up our own markets to external competition? This mantra is, I think, vastly overdone amongst international organizations and some prominent economists. You can reduce your current account imbalances either by reducing exports, or you can reduce your current account imbalances by keeping exports healthy and vibrant and at the same time growing your imports, opening up our markets to competition. The two look the same when you look at current account balances, which are a great focus in the G20 and every international discussion, but they are very different when we look at the acquisition of skills, when we look at technological progress, when we look at entrepreneurship. So focus on the supply side. And when we focus on the supply side, it is uncontested that looking outward and competing in global markets and subjecting our own markets to competition is a superior strategy for all of us. The second reason why it's important to look outward and not inward has to do with political economy. The strategy of producing for domestic markets and protecting yourself quietly or loudly from imports is also a strategy which tends to be prone to what the economists call rent-seeking and regulatory capture. Domestic lobbies getting benefits for themselves, invested interests, usually incumbents who are already in a position of advantage, tend to manipulate the system better than others, better than startups, better than new players. So the political economy of import substitution or any inward-looking strategy is always one that's prone to supporting an existing elite and with scope for other forms of abuses. So that's another very important reason why we have to stay outwardly focused, stay market-oriented. So that's one theme I wanted to say, and it's a truism almost, but unfortunately it's not accepted as true, and we need to keep reminding ourselves of it. The second theme has to do with us thinking fundamentally about skills and capabilities. Asia has a demographic dividend, as we put it, outside of China. China is a society that's getting older, but Asia outside of China, emerging Asia outside of China, has a demographic dividend, young populations, and that's potentially a huge advantage. But it is not a given that it's going to be a dividend as opposed to distress. It may well be demographic distress. A very large proportion of emerging Asia's population is now below the age of 20, about 1/3. Whether we look at Indonesia or India or Southeast Asia at large, emerging Asia, is about 1/3 that's below the age of 20. They will soon be in the workforce. And if we have to look at it objectively as it stands now, a very large proportion of our young people are not prepared for the world of the future. And it's only a demographic dividend if people are well prepared and confident for the world of the future. Two reforms are worth serious thought. One, across Asia, education tends to be too academically focused at every level, including at the university level. You need a solid academic base in every society, but this academic model of education has been extended across society, with the result that you have a large number of graduates in China and India today who have difficulty getting employment until they go for retraining. It's true in most societies, even in Korea and Taiwan, very significant proportion of graduates who find themselves redundant and frustrated. The same is true in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Europe. Over-academization of education. The second problem is the front-loading of education to the early years in life, first 18 years of life, or perhaps first 22 years of life at most. And that combination of an overly academic education and front-loading it to that first phase of life doesn't prepare people well for the future. First, because no one knows what the future will be and what skills will really be needed. And it's impossible to prepare for the future in those early years of life. If you take a kid who's now 10 years old, let's say, someone who's in primary school, as we call it, by the time he or she, if they go through the whole system and get through to university, by the time they graduate, computers would be about, the experts say, about 100 times cheaper, and very importantly, 100 times smarter. It's going to transform the world of work in every area. What we now know of as areas where you have good middle-class jobs will be areas where you have highly intelligent machines, and we want to make sure that our people are there benefiting from the machines and still being masters of machines, not servants. How do we achieve it? In manufacturing and logistics, in services, in call centers, every area. That's a real challenge. And it means moving away from a model where we think we can prepare people in the first 16 years, 18 years, 22 years for a lifetime of confident work and development of themselves towards one of continuous development through life. Continuous development, lifelong learning has to be the way to go, and learning that's integrated with the world, of the real world, integrated with developments in technology, with the opportunities that arise. That's my first theme. Sorry, I'm speaking a bit longer than I intended, but it's critical to achieving broad prosperity for the future. The second theme, which I'll be briefer about, is that of keeping our societies together at a time of the globalization of sectarian conflict. In fact, a new phase of globalization of sectarian conflict is now with us and will be with us for a long time to come. And it means thinking very hard about how we maintain societies that are cohesive, where people have pride in their own cultures, religions, values, but have a very strong sense of common identity. How do we achieve it? How do we achieve a spirit where everyone feels they're advancing together and they're first and foremost members of the same society? That's a challenge that we all face, including the advanced countries. Don't forget that about 1/4 of the foreigners who've joined ISIS come from the United States, Europe, and Australia. Globalization of sectarian conflict and beliefs. Every society faces this challenge. And the whole experiment in Europe and the United Kingdom of multiculturalism has, by their own admission, failed. As Merkel put it very bluntly a year ago, it has failed. What was thought of as a neat liberal model of multiculturalism has failed. So each society is different in our composition, our history, but we all have to do fundamental thinking. How do we hold people together, give them the pride of their own religion and beliefs and cultures, but maximize common space and develop a common identity for the future? It's critical to all of us. And it's critical from every dimension: economic, social, moral, political. Just that sense of common identity. So when we talk about smart cities, urbanization, everything else we talk about in Asia, it's not just about the technology, it's not just about the economic opportunities, it's about integration, it's about opportunities, it's about shared futures. And we have to place that foremost in our minds as our objective. Thank you for listening to my opening remarks.